You know that moment. It's early morning. You're standing in front of the bathroom mirror, maybe just out of the shower, and your hand moves there, almost automatically. Right there, just above the waistband. You grab it, that same stubborn layer of fat that refuses to move. Doesn't matter that you've been skipping the bread. Doesn't matter that you dragged yourself to the gym 3 times this week. It's still there, looking back at you, completely unbothered. And here's what makes it worse. It's not just about how your clothes fit. It's not just vanity. You know, somewhere in the back of your mind, that this particular fat, the kind that sits deep in your midsection, wrapped around your organs, is different. You've read enough to know it's connected to your blood sugar, your heart health, your energy, your hormones. You know it's not just a cosmetic problem. And yet, nothing you've tried has made a real dent in it. The salads, the calorie counting, the cardio. The number on the scale bounces around, but that belly stays exactly where it is. And then someone tells you about intermittent fasting. Maybe it was a colleague at work. Maybe it was a podcast. Maybe it was a physician's assistant who mentioned it in passing. And you wonder, is this real? Is there actually something to it? Or is this just another trend dressed up in scientific language? Here's what I want you to understand before we go any further. Intermittent fasting is not a diet in the traditional sense. It is not about what you eat. It is about when you eat. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this conversation, because it changes the biological mechanisms entirely. Your belly fat, the deep, visceral kind, does not respond to the same signals as the fat on your thighs or under your arms. It has its own biology, its own hormonal environment, its own defense mechanisms. And the reason conventional dieting fails so consistently at targeting it is that conventional dieting speaks the wrong language. It cuts calories without changing the underlying hormonal conditions that allowed that fat to accumulate in the first place. What I'm going to do in this video is take you inside your own body, hour by hour and week by week, and show you exactly what happens to your belly fat when you practice intermittent fasting. Not the simplified version, not the marketing pitch. The actual cellular and hormonal mechanisms explained the way they deserve to be explained to someone who is serious about understanding their own biology. Stay with me through the first 15 minutes. Because what happens at the 12-hour mark, the 16-hour mark, and beyond is not what most people expect. And the difference between the people who see results and the people who quit is almost always that they didn't understand what was actually happening. So when it happened, they mistook it for failure. Let's start with the most important concept in this entire conversation: insulin. If you want to understand why belly fat accumulates, why it resists dieting, and why intermittent fasting works differently than caloric restriction alone, insulin is the molecule you need to understand. Insulin is a hormone produced by your pancreas. Every time you eat, every time you consume carbohydrates, protein, or fat, your blood glucose rises. Your pancreas detects that rise, and it releases insulin to shuttle that glucose into your cells for energy or storage. This is a normal, healthy process. Insulin is not your enemy. But here's the problem that develops over years of modern American eating patterns. Specifically, the pattern of eating every 2 to 3 hours from morning until late at night. When you eat constantly, your insulin levels are constantly elevated. Not at dangerous levels, but chronically, persistently higher than they would be if your body had regular, extended periods without food. And chronically elevated insulin has one critical downstream effect that matters enormously for belly fat. It keeps your body in storage mode. Specifically, it suppresses lipolysis, the process by which your fat cells release stored fatty acids into circulation to be burned for energy. When insulin is elevated, your fat cells essentially get a signal that says, "Hold what you have, do not release. We have energy coming in from food. and we do not need to tap into your reserves right now. This is the metabolic trap that most people are stuck in without realizing it. They are eating in a pattern that chronically prevents their body from accessing its own fat stores. Not because of the total calories, not because they are eating the wrong foods, but because their insulin never gets low enough for long enough to allow meaningful fat mobilization to occur. And visceral belly fat, the fat packed around your liver, your intestines, your pancreas, is the most metabolically sensitive fat in your body. It responds powerfully to insulin. When insulin goes up, visceral fat locks down. When insulin comes down and stays down for an extended period, visceral fat is among the first to begin mobilizing stored fatty acids. This is the core mechanism of intermittent fasting. It is not primarily about eating fewer calories, although a caloric reduction often occurs as a natural consequence. It is about creating extended windows of low insulin, giving your body long enough without incoming food that insulin drops, lipolysis activates, and your fat cells begin releasing energy into circulation. The length and consistency of those low insulin windows determine how aggressively your body targets its fat stores. And that timeline is more specific than most people realize. Here is what actually happens inside your body on a standard 16 to 8 intermittent fasting protocol. 16 hours of fasting, 8 hours of eating on a typical day. This is the hour-by-hour breakdown that almost nobody explains. Hours 0 through 4. You finish your last meal. Your blood glucose rises and then begins to fall as insulin clears the glucose from circulation. Your body is still in a post-absorptive state, meaning it is processing and distributing the nutrients from that last meal. Insulin is falling, but still meaningfully elevated. Fat cells are not yet in significant release mode. This is normal physiology after any meal. Nothing dramatic is happening yet. Hours 4 through 8. Insulin levels continue declining. Your liver, which has been storing glucose as glycogen, your body's carbohydrate reserve, begins to release that glycogen back into circulation to maintain blood glucose as insulin falls and no new food is coming in. Your body is still running primarily on glucose at this stage. The glycogen tank is being slowly drained. This is still not the stage where intermittent fasting is doing something meaningfully different from what happens during any normal overnight sleep. Hours 8 through 12. This is where things begin to shift. Your liver glycogen stores are becoming depleted. Insulin has fallen to a genuinely low baseline level. Your body is beginning to transition from running primarily on glucose to running increasingly on fat. Hormone-sensitive lipase, the enzyme that breaks down stored triglycerides inside fat cells, becomes more active as insulin's suppressive influence continues to decline. Your fat cells begin releasing fatty acids into circulation. Your liver starts converting some of those fatty acids into ketone bodies, alternative fuel molecules that your brain and other tissues can use in the absence of sufficient glucose. You are entering what researchers call the metabolic switch, the shift from glucose-dominant fuel use to fat-dominant fuel use. Hours 12 through 16. This is the window that makes 16-hour fasting specifically effective and not simply equivalent to a long sleep. By hour 12 to 14, research shows that circulating ketone bodies begin to rise measurably. Autophagy, the cellular cleanup process by which your cells break down and recycle damaged proteins and organelles, begins to be meaningfully activated around the 16-hour mark, according to a comprehensive review published in the journal Nutrients. Growth hormone, which promotes fat oxidation and muscle preservation, increases significantly during extended fasting periods. And here is the one that matters most for visceral belly fat specifically: norepinephrine. Your body's primary fat-mobilizing signal rises during fasting, and visceral fat tissue is particularly dense with the adrenergic receptors that respond to norepinephrine. This is why visceral belly fat is not simply harder to lose. It is biologically primed to respond to the exact hormonal conditions that intermittent fasting creates, not to the conditions that caloric restriction creates. To the conditions of genuinely low insulin combined with elevated norepinephrine and growth hormone signaling. Those conditions only emerge when you have gone without food for a meaningful enough window. You cannot produce them by simply eating a smaller lunch. Now, here is the honest nuance that nobody in the intermittent fasting community wants to talk about, and it is important. Visceral fat is also capable of developing a degree of resistance to fat mobilization in response to certain fasting patterns. A 2021 study from researchers at the University of Sydney, using detailed proteomics analysis of fat tissue during alternate day fasting, found that visceral fat, in particular, showed signs of activating a preservation signaling pathway during repeated fasting bouts. The visceral fat appeared to be reducing its release of fatty acids and simultaneously upregulating its capacity to rebuild fat stores rapidly during feeding windows, as if it had learned to protect itself from the repeated fasting cycle. This is a finding that deserves serious attention, and it has often been mischaracterized in both directions. Some people have used it to claim that intermittent fasting doesn't work on belly fat at all. Others have ignored it entirely. The accurate interpretation sits in the middle. This adaptation appears to be more pronounced under alternate day fasting protocols, full or near full fast days, alternating with unrestricted eating days. It appears less pronounced or possibly absent under time-restricted eating protocols, where the eating window is compressed but not eliminated on a daily basis. And critically, it does not appear to prevent visceral fat loss over extended periods. The larger clinical literature, including a 2025 meta-analysis published in Obesity Reviews that synthesized 24 randomized controlled trials involving over 2,000 participants, found that intermittent fasting significantly reduced visceral fat compared to control conditions, with a meaningful, standardized mean difference in visceral fat reduction. The key is understanding what type of fasting, at what duration, and over what time frame produces optimal results. And we are going to get into exactly that in detail. But first, let's go deeper into the hormonal picture, because the insulin and norepinephrine story is only part of what makes intermittent fasting distinctly effective for the kind of fat that sits deepest in your body. Visceral belly fat is not simply stored energy. This is one of the most important things that clinical research over the past 2 decades has revealed about this specific tissue. Visceral adipose tissue, the fat surrounding your abdominal organs, is metabolically active in ways that subcutaneous fat, the fat just under your skin, is not. Visceral fat cells contain and secrete a range of inflammatory signaling molecules called adipokines and cytokines, including tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin-6, and a protein called resistin. These molecules do not simply sit there. They circulate in your bloodstream. They reach your liver, your pancreas, your blood vessels, your brain. What they do when they get there is destructive in a very specific way. They promote insulin resistance. They make your cells less responsive to insulin's signal to absorb glucose. This means your pancreas has to produce more insulin to achieve the same glucose-clearing effect. More insulin means more fat storage signaling, which means more visceral fat, which produces more inflammatory cytokines, which worsens insulin resistance further. This is a self-reinforcing cycle, and it is the reason that the longer someone carries excess visceral fat, the harder it becomes to lose. Not because of willpower, not because of caloric math, but because the fat itself is actively creating the hormonal conditions that protect its own survival. This is the biological armor that the original transcript from the uploaded video referred to, and it was actually onto something real, even if the explanation was imprecise. Visceral fat does create a kind of protective biochemical environment around itself. It alters the hormonal landscape of your entire body in ways that favor its own preservation. And the only way to break that cycle is through an approach that addresses the root driver: chronically elevated insulin and chronic low-grade systemic inflammation, simultaneously and consistently. This is precisely what intermittent fasting does when practiced correctly and consistently over weeks and months. The 5-to-2 protocol. 5 days of normal eating and 2 non-consecutive days of either complete fasting or severe caloric restriction, typically 500 to 600 calories, produces a different hormonal pattern than daily time-restricted eating. The 2 fasting days create more dramatic and prolonged insulin suppression than any daily protocol. The concern is the visceral fat preservation response I mentioned earlier from the Sydney proteomics research, which appeared more pronounced in alternate day and severely restricted models. The 5-to-2 works well for some individuals, particularly those who find daily eating window restriction psychologically difficult, but may need to be cycled or combined with other approaches to prevent adaptive fat preservation over longer time periods. 1 meal a day, or OMAD, is the most aggressive common protocol and the one that carries the most nuanced risk-benefit profile. Compressing all caloric intake into a single meal produces extreme low insulin duration for the majority of the day, very high growth hormone response, and significant autophagic activity. It also creates substantial challenges for meeting protein targets, micronutrient needs, and training recovery, particularly for anyone engaged in meaningful resistance training. For most people, OMAD is not a sustainable long-term daily strategy. It may be useful as an occasional tool, a once or twice weekly structure within a broader framework, but not as a primary daily protocol. Here is the practical hierarchy for someone starting from 0. Weeks 1 and 2. Shift your first meal from breakfast to noon. Do not change anything else. Do not count calories. Do not restrict food types. Just move the eating window. Your body needs time to adapt to the fasting state, and the first 2 weeks will include some hunger in the morning that diminishes as your body recalibrates its ghrelin, your primary hunger hormone, to your new eating pattern. Hunger hormones are remarkably trainable. Within 10 to 14 days, most people find that morning hunger largely resolves on its own. Weeks 3 through 8. Maintain the 16 to 8 window consistently. Add a protein target. Your body weight in pounds multiplied by 0.7 gives you a reasonable daily gram target for most adults. Protein is the most important dietary variable within the eating window because it preserves muscle mass, drives the highest thermic effect of any macronutrient, and promotes satiety in ways that prevent the overeating during the eating window that can undermine the caloric benefits of fasting. Hydration during the fasting window matters practically. Black coffee, plain tea, and water do not meaningfully break a fast in terms of insulin response and are appropriate during fasting hours. They also significantly reduce the subjective difficulty of the fasting period. Weeks 8 through 24. Evaluate your results and calibrate. If visceral fat reduction is progressing, measurable through waist circumference, through how your clothes fit, through energy levels and blood glucose patterns if you monitor them, maintain the protocol. If progress has plateaued, consider extending to 18 to 6 on training days. Consider adding resistance training if not already present, because the combination of fasting-induced hormonal changes with the androgen receptor upregulation and metabolic demand of strength training produces synergistic effects on visceral fat that neither intervention achieves alone. Consider reviewing your eating window for unconscious grazing patterns that may be keeping insulin higher than intended. Beyond the protocol itself, there are several variables that the research consistently identifies as either amplifying or undermining the visceral fat reduction response to intermittent fasting. Sleep is the most powerful. Poor sleep, consistently under 7 hours, elevates cortisol, suppresses growth hormone, worsens insulin sensitivity, and increases ghrelin, your hunger hormone, while reducing leptin, your satiety hormone. Practicing intermittent fasting on a foundation of chronic sleep deprivation is like trying to build something on unstable ground. The structure keeps shifting. 7 to 9 hours of consistent, good quality sleep is not optional for people serious about metabolic health. It is foundational in a way that no dietary intervention compensates for. Resistance training is the second most powerful amplifier. The visceral fat reduction from intermittent fasting, combined with 3 to 4 sessions of progressive resistance training per week, is consistently larger in the literature than from fasting alone or training alone. The mechanisms are complementary and synergistic. Fasting creates the hormonal environment for fat mobilization. Training creates the metabolic demand that consumes that mobilized fat and simultaneously builds the metabolically active muscle tissue that raises your resting energy expenditure. You are creating both the supply and the demand simultaneously. Stress management is third. Not because it is less important in isolation. Chronic psychological stress is one of the most powerful drivers of visceral fat accumulation and one of the most powerful blockers of its reduction. But because it is the variable that people most consistently resist addressing, because it requires the most difficult life changes. The cortisol produced by sustained psychological stress directly promotes visceral fat deposition, directly suppresses the fat mobilization pathways that fasting activates, and directly disrupts the sleep quality that everything else depends on. If you are practicing intermittent fasting meticulously while living in a state of chronic, unmanaged stress, you are working against yourself in a way that will eventually produce diminishing returns, regardless of how tight your eating window is.